Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our third panel. Today we will be talking about the infrastructure layer of blockchains, layer one. Really excited to have this panel together to share their time and their big brains and hopefully a little bit of alpha too. I'm Alex. I help lead business development for Sushi, and I will be moderating this panel with everyone. So just to get things kicked off, would love to get a short introduction from everyone. So I guess, David, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, glad to kick it off. Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Yornak. I'm the Director of Ecosystem Development at TronDAO. I'll stop there.
Great. Awesome. Kendall?
Hey everyone, my name is Kendall. I'm one of the co-founders of Proximity, which is an ecosystem fund for Near focused specifically on DeFi.
Awesome. Isha?
Hi everyone, my name is Isha. I head DeFi at Sala Foundation. Nice to meet you all.
Great. And then James and then Luigi.
Hi everyone, James Hodgkins here. I'm head of DeFi at Aptos Labs, a new layer one built on the Move programming language.
Hey everyone, Luigi Denari De Meo here with Ava Labs. I run DeFi for Ava Labs and also recently head up our developer relations initiative as well, helping to build the Avalanche blockchain.
Amazing. So for everyone viewing this video or attending the hackathon, we have some pretty big powerhouses in the room here. So I'm really excited to really kick off some of these questions. So I guess one of the first things that is definitely probably on the minds of a lot of people, layer one and the alt layer one kind of narrative has been pretty big in our space over the last few months. And kind of coinciding with that is this boom in layer twos and also potentially even layer threes. So kind of to kick things off, really curious, what are the challenges that are facing layer one blockchains today and how are they being addressed? And I'll just popcorn it over to James and then feel free to jump in for anyone else.
Yeah, on the subject of constraints around L1s and L2s today, I think the success of Arbitrum in particular in Q4 has shown the importance of DeFi and that really being kind of that initial use case that most of us got into crypto for. And you don't see that going away regardless of whatever macro dynamics are happening or whether, whatever NFT project is exciting or game is taking off. DeFi is still kind of the core of crypto. And I think the limitations that we're starting to run into, and that's why you see these L2s, beginning to do well, is really around, restraints around what you can really get out of infrastructure, as well as the underlying functionality that's capable in smart contracting languages in general. I think you're starting to see more dynamic and high performant use cases in DeFi beyond those that were so prevalent in the last bull cycle. And I think when things pick back up, that's really what's going to kind of be the turning point for DeFi, to where you see not only mass retail adoption across various protocols, but additionally some traditional financial adoption as well, both from a trading and let's say staking and LP providing perspective.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think that a really good point there is that we actually have a lot more throughput now, due in large part to, I think, a lot of the teams on this call and some of the tech that we've been building. And we're just starting to really see apps that are actually taking and use cases that are actually really taking advantage of all that throughput. And I certainly personally expect that a lot of what the DeFi that comes out of kind of the next cycle that's sort of taking advantage of this is going to look at least a little bit different than DeFi 1.0 that was really more built around some of the kind of limitations. I mean, also in like certain accessibility of Ethereum, and we're starting to see that on the alt layer ones, on layer twos, and beyond.
Yeah, one thing I think relative to DeFi as well as layer ones, one thing that is an issue is the interoperability of the chains. I think last year was the largest year or the greatest amount of hacks, since it's been recorded, I think the total was 3.8 billion, and according to Chainalysis, I think probably 3.1 billion came through DeFi protocols, and of that, there was 2 billion hacked through interoperability. So I'd be curious to understand your view, everyone's view on interoperability, and how that needs to improve for layer ones and even layer twos.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, David. You know, one thing I like to tell a lot of people that bring this up, especially with respect to bridges and hacks and everything is that has happened, is that, you know, we really only saw innovation on the bridging space because of the first other chain other than Ethereum that came on in like 2021. So this is like a very new design space, I think, that people are still exploring with. And like with the advent of, you know, the XLRs, layer zeros, wormholes, all these other bridges that are coming about, hopefully there's, you know, continued R&D that can, you know, proliferate a little bit in this endeavor. Now, one of the reasons that Avalanche was architected the way it was in particular is it enables sort of in protocol bridging with subnets in particular. And because of that, like, we feel that's a huge value add for the DeFi ecosystem there. But I think on top of that layer is where we need more research and development, which is where these other third-party teams that are building can kind of advance the ball down the field a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with, I think, everything you guys all said. Interoperability is really big. The next question for movement of liquidity across the ecosystems. But I think also, I think we need to step back and think about like even just core stacks, about like the layer ones and who is building on these core stacks. For example, if you want like really fast transaction speeds, then you go build on Solana. But if you want to be like mobile first, then you kind of come and build on Celo, because we are a live client. We are kind of servicing like, I want to say 6.4 billion mobile users across the world. If you're looking so it depends on what segment of DeFi you're talking about. If you're talking about building real world use cases that kind of talk to emerging markets around the world with like live clients, then you kind of build on us. If you're looking for like high liquidity, high transaction, high like, you kind of go back to Ethereum. So like, I think it's also really important to think about like, what are the core stacks and who's building and like what you're building on.
Yeah, Isha, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that's something you're starting to see more and more in the layer one space is kind of specialization of the chains, right? So, you know, Polygon, or even though it's a layer two, mostly, you know, very big in NFTs, and Tron, you know, we're very big in payments and stable coins. And there's others that are focused on IoT and, you know, all different and some on gaming. So I think you are starting to see that specialization come into the market, because it is getting to be somewhat of a crowded market, which I think only increases the need for more interoperability.
I really like
foundationally.
Sorry, James.
Go ahead,
Go for it.
Yeah. I think foundationally, you know, regardless of specialization, what we've seen over the past 6 to 12 months is really more of an infrastructure stability issue. So regardless of what the use case might be and how a chain wants to specifically, you know, engineer itself and market itself, that's been something that has, you know, kind of hurt the credibility of Web3 as we continue to not only expand retail adoption, but also, you know, go farther up market. And, you know, real world assets are a big topic of discussion this year already, despite everything going on. And that's not really going to take off until, you know, all of us have a long history of stability. And so that's something I think, you know, all the L1s, you know, Aptos included, seem to be really doubling down on this year.
Mm-hmm.
I really like where all of this is going. I'm kind of curious, you know, coming out of East Denver, for example, one of the biggest buzzwords that I kept hearing was account abstraction, and kind of just the idea that eventually we're going to get to this point where end users don't know they're using DeFi or don't know that they're using crypto or a layer one. You know, it just works. And the idea that, you know, that in the future, the end user doesn't really care or really need to know what layer one, layer two, layer three, four, five, or whatever they're using. So I'm curious, what is everyone's thoughts around how are you building for that future? I know we were kind of talking about interoperability, but is it just that, or are there other things?
Well, you need really secure. I mean, so there's kind of a bridging trilemma right now. There's like, cheap, fast, secure. Like, which ones are you kind of going to have? I think we're seeing some really interesting solutions being developed towards that, but realistic, a lot of them are ZK based, and I think or just requiring chains to actually build kind of more interoperability into the base layer, and that is going to take some time to actually really play out. So I think the vision of kind of an agnostic interface layer on top of these chains, it's abstracting it away, is absolutely the future. There's no question, and that's actually a really big focus for us at Near. But I think the reality of it is that it is going to take some time before we can actually get to that point, and so it's going to be more about each of us as like individual chains and product and really products and applications, abstracting that away from the blockchain, away from the user experience as much as possible in our own ecosystem before we see this kind of multi-chain, just totally abstracted away type of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
No. Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of what we're doing to kind of do this account abstraction thing is because I think the users in our ecosystem are really bottom of the pyramid in emerging markets. A lot of our work is around like figuring out like really great on-ramps and off-ramps across the globe. It's also a part of our ecosystem is also figuring out like, hey, how do we have modularity in services, for instance, infrastructure services like identity, KYC, etc., that kind of plug in from your Web 2 credentials, and so you don't have to like go in and get a MetaMask wallet or go in and like have these really scary protocols that you need to interact with DeFi or to interact with Web3. How do we kind of make all of that so simple that like it's as easy as like sending a text message? And that's, I think, where we're kind of heading down that path at Celo, at least. Like, how do we make this really simple? How do you not have to use more than like 3 clicks of a button to kind of get a loan, a DeFi loan? How do you get like to save into a savings pool? So like these are some of the things that we're working on at Celo at the point. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think user friendliness and user experience is incredibly important, and that's going to help to drive consumer preferences for these new applications, and whether or not they know their blockchain or crypto or whatever is, hopefully they don't care. And that's the point where we want to get to, is that blockchain and crypto aren't these new and different things that people need to get comfortable with. They're just how business works, right? And I think that's what we're working toward. And we have to get through this point of adoption, at least one way on the commercial side. And I think that's going to be driven by one. I think you're going to see a lot of strong traditional business cases for crypto blockchain applications, right? They drive engagement, they improve efficiency, they do all the traditional business things that companies want to see. And then on the other side, I think another part of that is consumer preferences are going to evolve to where they prefer to transact using these new technologies. And they don't understand why they work better, but they're faster, they're easy. And one thing I think is going to help move that along is this ERC 4337, which helps users recover their keys in case they lose them for wallets. I think that's really going to be a big driver. So yeah, hopefully, we can get there.
Yeah, I think one of the core, innovations the space has brought and continues to remain the core innovation is non-custodial holding of your assets, right? Private ownership and the ability to house your assets without trusting another intermediary. And it's very important, like, because a lot of the events of last year proved that, we sort of strayed away from those values a little bit in terms of what the actual premise of the space was. And so while the UX needs to improve and we need to do everything we can to obfuscate away some interactions that aren't necessary, at the end of the day, that core premise of non-custodial ownership of one's assets, I think it needs to remain core if we're going to actually deliver upon, what we set out to do in this space.
I think asset custody and wallet infrastructure is a tremendous piece to onboarding the next billion users or whatever you'd like to call it. But I also think building the use cases that those individuals want to interact with is still frankly a missing piece. All of us have been in DeFi for a long time. Think back to your early interactions. I remember when Sushi Swap launched and like being nervous about making those first transactions. It's scary, and so that's where I think I mentioned at the beginning that the actual smart contracting languages like Move that are able to empower developers to actually build some of these use cases. That what I tell people internally at Aptos I'm solving for is my 8-year-old daughter. Like, how do we build something that she wants to interact with? And sure, it's going to be games to start with, at her age, but how do we make that so that the fact that an L1 is really infrastructure at the end of the day, it shouldn't really matter what is powering that as long as it can be extensible and these use cases can be easily developed.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of you're exactly right, James. Like, there's no question but people will put up with bad experiences if what they're aiming to do is actually like desirable enough for them to put up with it. We see this all the time in software. Like, a lot of times the first product out the gate is actually terrible to use, but it is enabling something really new and different. So like, that's very much, one problem we have in crypto is like, because just because of the way things work, we tend to look inward a lot, and we get really focused on like, well, like, what new games can we create for like the current crypto community, instead of looking outwardly and thinking like, well, I mean, what problems can we actually solve? And Luigi addressed that quite nicely. Like, the non-custodial aspect is a really key part of that. I think another one is like kind of new access, right? I mean, some of the most creative things and greatest things we've come up with, and a lot of credit to Tron on this actually, is new access to certain assets for people that didn't have that access before. And I think like, yeah, USDT and some of these stable coins are really fascinating use cases of this in like the global South. So it's, we have to remember to keep our eye on the ball a little bit and keep looking outwardly instead of just looking inwardly, which is especially harder to do in a bull market.
Sorry, Isha, go for it.
I just wanted to add, right, like the real world asset, so much conversation around real world assets and bringing real world assets on chain, especially for DeFi. And I feel like I see a lot of news around this, like Onda Finance is bringing US Treasury, Siemens kind of issued a bond, etc. But all of this like pressure is all from the sell side, right? Where's the buy side pressure? If you had to go buy like US Treasuries, for instance, I grew up in Kenya, and like I've lived in Southeast Asia a long time in my life. If I want to buy US Treasuries, it's like a really long process. It takes me like 4 weeks to do KYC, right? We're talking about real world assets, bringing them on chain. You're looking at US Treasuries, et cetera, great. But if I have an interactive broker account, I have access to this, right? The point is, who are we like bringing these assets on chain for? Like, are we focusing on the right people? Is there buy pressure? Is there pressure from buy side? Like, can we do this? Like, the cool thing about blockchain and Web3 is that you can bring all of this to like emerging markets, to people that don't have access to financial infrastructure so far, access to these kind of asset classes. So like, are we thinking about bringing all of these asset classes to people that don't have access? Or are we just kind of going back again in the circle where these exist, we're just bringing them on chain for users that already have access? I think that's also a really interesting aspect to think about.
Yeah, I would really go ahead. Sorry, Alex.
Oh, I definitely wanted to segue from that as well. I got into this space based on, the idea that this is the technology that can power the rise of the rest. So in what I've kind of been hearing a lot and curious about people's thoughts are, as we're talking about traditional finance, we're talking about, bringing real world assets on chain, there's this kind of like interaction now between blockchain and traditional finance and how people are using it. I'm curious what everyone's thoughts are around, what are the implications of these interactions? Where's that going to take us the end of this year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? James, when your 8-year-old daughter is, running companies in the future, like, what is the future going to hold for her with how she interacts with, traditional finance at that point in time?
So I guess since we mentioned my daughter, I'll start. So I think, look, first, when it comes to the interaction with traditional financial use cases, I think there's still a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty. There's lots of things occurring right now that I'm sure, all of you are experiencing in your TradFi conversations that, we're monitoring the situation and happy to explore use cases, but things are a little bit dicey right now. Now, regardless of that, and, as Isha was saying, like the real world asset use case is, I feel like, a big buzzword this year in the Web3 space. So I think a combination of that, as well as we're seeing a lot of interest in people building what I would call kind of secure LP dexes, to where, all participants in the liquidity pool are going to be fully KYC'd. We're also, specific to Aptos, because of, the level of performance we're able to get out of the chain, we're also seeing a lot of trading use cases begin to crop up. So people that have, traditional trading firms that have a higher risk appetite than, a bank tokenizing debt instruments, as an example. We are starting to see use cases like that begin to develop. And the arguments we're hearing is that, through faster chains, the edge of traditional trading firms is able to be given back to them, in essence. So no longer is it strictly a liquidity pool model, and that's the method of monetization. There's actual counterparty trading going on, and through central limit order books and derivatives platforms.
Yeah, I would echo some of what James has said. This has always been a prime mission for Avalanche. I think the slogan was digitize the world's assets forever. So the component for us that we thought was always interesting, the team has a lot of TradFi background. I worked at Citigroup for myself about 7 years, holding trading hats there. There's two ways I see DeFi and crypto interacting with traditional finance. One is this operational efficiency route, where you're really trying to reduce and pull out a lot of the operational costs within traditional finance around confirm, settlement, post and pre-trade execution. And on that route, that's a very 2017 concept, but something that we've been seeing a ton of traction on our side, because I think people, with the advent of DeFi, are now seeing, okay, wow, we can actually use these smart contracts, and these permissionless applications have actually built for us the programmability of what we're doing in our current roles while removing 15 middlewares. Now, the issue there is now you have to really take on a lot of the incumbents and stepping on their turf, which is sort of a complicated issue. The other route is this idea of tokenizing assets, whether that be treasuries or debt instruments and whatnot, and using DeFi rails to make those more interesting. So, tokenized treasuries maybe aren't that just interesting to hold, but being able to collateralize against them, borrow against them, potentially come up with interesting strategies to create baskets that you could hedge against components of that, I think could be intriguing as well. And ultimately, what we've seen from these institutions is they want customizability with, the layer that they build with. So subnets, for example, allow them to customize validator sets, gas tokens, and introduce different levers like KYC and KYB.
Yeah, one thing I think that's really going to move adoption along is, and I think Isha, James, and Luigi all mentioned it, is KYC. I think blockchain KYC is an incredibly important use case that needs to be solved really well. It can be done much better than it's done currently, and that could be really the blockchain killer app that everyone is looking for. It's a global issue, and it needs to be solved well. And really going forward, I think even DEXs might need to start to KYC as well. Particularly just looking at where hacks go, nearly 50% of hacked assets go to a DEX, right? And I could envision, as regulation picks up and becomes more stringent, that they're just required to have KYC or they can't operate. So I think that is one critical area for adoption.
Yeah, just building on what David said, I completely agree. KYC is a big piece, but it's also like stacking other services, right? How do we make it really easy for institutional players to come and play in DeFi and come and add liquidity to DeFi? So is it just KYC? Is it KYC and accounting and a whole bunch of other services? Can we stack them together and bundle them up as one service where you're just like, here, plug and play now. Like these are 5 different protocols. For instance, we have somebody called Quadrata that does institutional KYC for us, right? Can we add Quadrata with an accounting software, with a taxation software, with like a bunch of different protocols that do these interesting things and give them to the institutions to come and play? And then the other part, I think, especially for us at Celo, that's really important is like bringing assets on chain that have really like opaque markets, for instance, like digital environmental assets, carbon credits. We're really focusing on that aspect of bringing institutional liquidity into Web3 and into DeFi through these traditional markets where there was so much opacity. There's so much like, we're working with gold standards to kind of bring these assets on chain, have these like as like carbon credits that are like verified on chain from the moment that they've been like from the MRV to the point of sale. And so like thinking about it slightly differently, A, bundling services, but B, also bringing assets that are traditionally really difficult to trade for traditional finance. And there's like a really big market for these asset classes.
Yeah, I think no, definitely agree with a lot of that, Isha, and everyone else. I think that what's really interesting, and Luigi kind of brought this up with his comments about some of these things sounding like 2017 ideas. I think what actually, I mean, I was at Consensus in 2017, and we were doing a lot of POCs with like these legacy institutions, and I mean, really, it was just that it was like, oh, okay, like we can do a lot of this without a blockchain and just like by digital, like just digitization of our processes. But what actually really changed the conversation a lot was just when the DeFi itself got really big. I mean, the numbers started to look actually appealing to even traditional institutions, right? We started having like 100 billion TVL in DeFi, even though a lot of that was, kind of just creative accounting to be generous. And I think that that's kind of something that we need to continue to think about, is that like these efficiency gains are probably not actually worth a lot of the investment required to actually, really get these processes on chain. What's really going to move the needle for these institutions is like us figuring out these new markets that we can, and Isha, I think your point is very valid here, is like figuring out these new markets and figuring out how to bring those immediately onto the blockchain, like net new to the blockchain, or figuring out how to take, assets like treasuries and actually expand assets, not just like people who can access it in a different way, even though it's like not really new, but actually new people who can access it. And that's what's really going to get the attention of institutions, because then they actually have something to really play with here, rather than just investing in more infrastructure.
I think piggybacking off of that also, Kendall, you made a comment about when DeFi became interesting because of its size. I just actually looked this up. The derivatives market in 2022 was $630 trillion. You compare that to a retail spot, market, the numbers don't even matter. And I feel like derivatives are something that has been, there's been a handful of protocols that have done it reasonably well, but I think Q4 and into this year is when you're starting to see a lot of those much more interesting derivatives protocols begin to develop. So while I think real world assets are certainly a very popular topic right now, I think as we call it at Aptos, high performance DeFi, I think that's also going to be a tremendous market unlock for Web3 in general that's coming this year.
Gets around the interoperability question a little bit too. That's one of the issues we see with Spot.
Sure,
is things people want to trade are on various chains, and then you basically need a bridge, which is not ideal. Whereas fortunately with some of like native issuance of some of these stable coins, derivatives are actually much more viable and secure.
Moving on from that, kind of curious, layer one, it really serves as this kind of base layer infrastructure for a lot of our space. I'm curious, how do you approach governance of such a ethereal kind of idea of running a blockchain? How does governance work in a decentralized fashion when you're still running pretty critical infrastructure?
Can you define governance a bit more? What do you mean by that?
Great. I feel like this can be taken in any way, really. How do you define both the governance of the chain and what developments you choose to pursue, or what direction you choose? Also, the level of decentralization that you feel is necessary for each of your protocols.
Sure, I'll dive in. So I think that decentralization in this space was meant to be used in a very specific way, and what it was really meant to be used and kind of done with was really around the idea of censorship resistance. Like that was the point of bringing decentralization into layer one blockchain, right? And I think because of the success of that and the novelty behind that idea, which allowed for blockchains to have this property, the second order effect was that we need to decentralize everything. Me personally, I'm not like a major fan of that. I think that you need core teams working on core projects with expertise that can deliver. That's not to say that governance is not something that you need. I think it's absolutely needed for a public good. But I don't think governance on every single variable in every single point of a protocol makes any sense at all. Like you end up finding these votes there's a ton of people with very little expertise about what's going on. They don't spend the time to actually read it. And then you get to an outcome that wasn't really desired. Whereas really maybe governance should be more about the stronger structure, implementing that and allowing the team to sort of deliver upon the variables and different items to kind of change within. So, that's kind of how I think about it. I think decentralization is important for censorship resistance, but it's not, decentralize everything and everybody and everyone.
100% agree with Luigi. That was really well said. I think of decentralization very much as a sliding scale, and there are trade-offs at every single step along that path. And while, Ethereum's level of decentralization is, incredible, very well done, it also impacts their ability to iterate and provide meaningful updates over time, to be quite frank here. You don't see that in chains that are willing, like Luigi was saying, to have core teams that are responsible for things, push that out for feedback into the community and ecosystem, and then take governance votes upon it. Aptos is an example. We're pushing our v1.3 update next week to testnet, and that wouldn't have been feasible if we had over-rotated at mainnet in October into 100% decentralization. Something like that just isn't feasible. And so unless one wants to launch a monolithic chain that is viewed as, perfect and then turning loose on day one, there has to be some granularity in there.
I just want to echo what James said. So even at Celo, we do have a core team that kind of works on functionality of the layer one as well as like the ecosystem. But then we also have decentralized. For instance, we're now having because we are like so global and like across the global south. So we're now decentralizing our operations in like certain jurisdictions. We just like had an Africa DAO proposal that was launched where all the operational decisions, et cetera, will for the Celo ecosystem will be held by the Africa team as part of a separate entity called the Africa DAO. And so decentralization also is multiple things in multiple ways. And so it's how you do it. You do have a core team always, but then also like once the core teams deliver something, you push it for feedback, get feedback from the community, and then kind of work on it and iterate. That's at least how we do it at Celo.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Isha. Like that's a lot of how we view it too. I think decentralization is almost more additive. It's like, it's not that you want to like remove a part of centralization, more you want to add like core contributors who are elevated to a similar level, or at least have like a similar kind of amount of influence and ways that they can participate in basically in the protocol or in the project or whatever it is. And I think as Isha also said, like there's a lot of levels to kind of decentralize. You can decentralize protocol development, you can decentralize kind of marketing, you can decentralize funding. Like there's a lot of different things to decentralize. And kind of our approach has been like just adding new organizations, like Proximity is an example of this, that are actually able to kind of, whether distribute funding or like participate in certain ways, rather than the kind of like thinking about how to remove the influence of certain entities.
Great. So one of the questions that has definitely been, I think, on the minds of almost everyone over the last few years, we're almost 15 years from the Bitcoin white paper, almost a decade since the Ethereum white paper. And kind of with each of the releases of those, it kind of led to almost a Cambrian explosion of new use cases, new dApps, and new users really come into the space. So, kind of with that in mind, really curious to see within, each layer one kind of has its own ecosystem. So I'm curious, does that, are there things to look forward to, or kind of how are you each viewing, the growth of this, or what is that next Cambrian explosion, I guess, within each of your ecosystems?
I'll get started. So, Aptos, same as everyone here. Aptos is very much a general use chain. We're seeing really large, games begin to come over, like MPixel, large social media platforms like Chingari coming over. But from a purely DeFi perspective, and I've said it a few times here, the really exciting protocols that get me out of bed in the morning are those high performance use cases. We're a very new chain. We launched in October. We're excited to see these really push the limits of what people think is feasible for on-chain trading. So once again, the derivatives markets, we have a number of central limit order books that are going to be launching in the next 4 to 6 weeks. All of those combined, I'm very excited to see. To the point about kind of use cases that were a better user experience, if you will. That kind of centralized exchange experience on chain. There's a lot of effort being put into that right now.
Yeah, I think that's also a big use case we're seeing as well. We take I think, a little bit of a different approach, obviously, a little bit more modular approach with subnets. So we're seeing a lot of people, test and innovate on the central limit order book front, or even AMM front, directly with their own chains. So I think the next exploration, at least for us on the Avalanche front, since we launched Avalanche Warp Messaging, AWM, which is the messaging layer for subnets to communicate with each other, I think we're seeing like a lot of innovation directly in the chain level. So whether that's like playing with precompiles or the validator set to actually have true decentralized order matching, or seeing different things that can be done in terms of token economics, right, when you have the chain level. So we're really just excited of seeing this modular approach, because we fundamentally don't believe any one general purpose chain has enough throughput to handle any actual real real use cases. You put 2 central limit order books on a chain, you start to throw some DeFi in there. Once the MEV kicks up, you're basically in a situation where there's no way you're going to have the type of latency that's required for Web 2 or even traditional finance. So that's just like a fundamental belief we have, and it'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out over time.
Yeah, at Tron, what we're really looking at is continuing to evolve within the payment space. We brought on a couple countries where TRX is the official cryptocurrency of the country. We're projected to bring on a few more this year. We continue to grow within the APAC region. And we want to take that further into the Americas. So I think we continue to do that and continue to move down that path. And that's really where our focus is.
Yeah, for us at Near, our focus has actually shifted kind of further up the stack towards the interface layer. We recently announced a new product called BOS, Blockchain Operating System, which is focused on decentralized front ends for any chain. And that includes every single one of you on this call, by the way. And yeah, I mean, basically, we view that as an area that still needs quite a bit of work. I think many of us in the DeFi space have seen how important decentralized front ends can be, especially with kind of the way things have been evolving over the last couple of weeks and months. And the future that we see is like a modular interface layer that's composable and multi-chain that can then use the Near blockchain for some higher throughput sort of use cases, which can be like messaging or kind of social functionality, or like Sweatcoin, which has quite a few daily active users and needs a high throughput and that type of thing.
Yeah, just to go quickly, I think at Sella we have a very different focus. I think our focus is refi, so we're betting big on getting digital environmental assets on chain. We're also betting big on getting real world use cases that are in the global south or in emerging markets. So things like microinsurance that are triggered by soil moisture levels in Kenya for farmers, etc. And then the other space is also we're focusing now on getting roll-ups, and so for enterprises to kind of figure out real world use cases, but in a private way. And so these are 2 different areas I think that we are focusing on right now. Yeah.
Wow. I love the scalability also to, the global south and kind of like the rest. I think in this space we tend to get very closed-minded, or we have a very telescopic view just straight into building for other nerds that love blockchain, rather than kind of what the additional use cases. So I think moving on from that, really curious, we're always talking about this trilemma of scaling, especially as we're thinking about bringing on the next 7.5 billion people into this space. And obviously, there's layer ones, layer two rollups. There's probably 3, 4, 5 different layers that need to be built in until everyone's, kind of involved in this space. So I'm curious for each of your ecosystems, there's a trade-off between cost and speed and security. So how are you approaching that, and kind of how does that dictate or I guess kind of police us for the future when we're bringing on all of these people into crypto?
I guess just to talk specifically about like our kind of mentality when it comes to scalability, we've actually been like from the beginning big believers that scalability is going to be achieved through asynchronicity. I think if you look at like sort of the way the Ethereum roadmap is going with like a base chain and then a bunch of different rollups that settle into it, in a lot of ways that's actually pretty similar to our approach, which is through homogeneous shards. The big difference being, of course, that these rollups are obviously non-homogeneous. So yeah, I think that like, and I see from the Avalanche guys too, right? Like I think this approach of you actually just can't have a single chain, or this is our belief at least, you can't have a single chain that's going to be able to handle all the settlement that's required. And so you're going to need kind of different components that'll all settle together, maybe in different times or in different ways to actually achieve the throughput that's needed.
Yeah, just because it's pretty similar to kind of how we think about it. We believe in horizontal scaling. The network will offset load onto new L1s or blockchains, which we call subnets, when there is load to be offloaded. We also wanted to design something that allows for people to customize blockchains, because we don't feel like general purpose blockchains will be the only way forward. We think people will actually want to sort of modify the stack. That's why we have subnets, which basically allow for custom virtual machines, or any type of virtual machine to be deployed, whether it's Move, EVM, any Rust-based, WASM-based. You could deploy that in your own subnet. We believe that allows for the developer to have the power in their hands to sort of deploy what they want, and then on top of that, have the messaging layers such that if you have a Move and an EVM and a Solana VM subnets live, that they can all talk to each other, but that only requires their validator sets to be making that communication, which we think is important.
Yeah,
I'll take the. Go ahead, David.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, Tron. We everything continues to work really well. We have almost 140 million accounts. We've done nearly 5 billion transactions, and with a block height approaching 50 million, we haven't really experienced any problems. The network doesn't go down, and it doesn't get hacked, and that's why I think we've been able to perform the way we have, and so we're just going to keep improving what we've done, and keep focusing on the payment space and becoming more prominent there. So yeah, I think we're very pleased with how the network's been performing.
Yeah, Aptos, we tend to fall into a somewhat similar camp as David. Aptos, as most people know, is kind of a byproduct of the DM Novi project at Facebook that was building for that type of Facebook scale. I used the next 1 billion users very intentionally, previously. So I think scalability for Aptos is something that we feel like we have a decent grasp on. I think the security element is something that that everyone needs to be laser focused on as we look to scale that retail adoption and general use. I think, Alex, you had asked for how does that manifest itself in the approaches we take as an L1. I think Aptos, we tend to err, very conservative as we iterate on the chain. So, a recent example of this is we had previously set our gas costs at mainnet, moderately high, by all L1 standards, I guess you could say. And that was done largely for security, from a security perspective to, cut down on any types of spam or DDoS that might take place. Over time, the feedback of the ecosystem over the past few months has shown, hey, we really need you all to take this down a notch. And so we announced last week that we're going to be lowering it by 100x. So I think security is paramount, but responding to community sentiment is key as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly follow that, James. So we just launched Seller 2.0, and it's like we're simplifying the process of tracking Ethereum forks and upstream changes, bringing new features like proto sharking to Celo as soon as possible, as soon as they're available, kind of thing. And then we were also proposing to make wrapped ETH as a gas token on Celo, in order to kind of have a trustless bridge between the Celo ecosystem and the Ethereum ecosystem. And I know I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but we're also kind of accelerating a roll-up centric approach by making it possible for projects to build like L2 roll-ups on top of Celo, and making that like a really great testing ground for like enterprises to explore roll-ups and side chains. Yeah, so that's our roadmap.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for sharing that. I think just to close out, one final question. Last year was quite the year for all of us in our space. This year's shaping up to be probably also pretty crazy as well. Looking at if we were to have this conversation a year from now, curious what trends and developments have occurred, especially around layer 1 in DeFi, and especially what impact will this have on DEXs and kind of the rest of the DeFi ecosystem?
Yeah, I think you're seeing a
the
lot
thing we're
of
all hoping for is
Yeah.
regulatory clarity would be, if we can end this year with knowing what we can and can't do, I think everyone on this meeting would be rather happy with that.
Yeah, I've been waiting for regulatory clarity for like, I don't know, since 2015. So I'm going to keep waiting.
Fair enough.
It is true though. We do need some semblance of clarity, especially in the US where I am. But would love to kind of see, I think we've seen a lot of concentrated liquidity DEXs deploy, which is interesting. I think it obviously moves the AMM space closer to what a centralized limited order book is and does. I'd really like to see some more, number one, research done on the differentiation between AMMs and also clubs, as it would be, because I do think like sort of a lot of the AMM volume we do see today, a good amount of that is just arbitrage from centralized exchanges. Would like to see better execution on chain, deeper liquidity on chain. Like we have the ability to have deeper liquidity on chain for these people who come in and want to move $100 million. Like when we can do that on chain versus in a centralized exchange, I think we'll probably have moved the ball down the field a lot. And the only way we can do that is when we have like really composable components sitting on top of DEXs, because like centralized exchanges just can't do that. So I think sort of innovating on that stack is what I'd love to see more of.
Yeah, I want to add on what Luigi just said, like adding composability to DEXs, I think is the way forward, right? Even just building on and off ramps to DEX infrastructure would be really great movement forward. And then from us, I think we need one killer DeFi app. And hopefully next year, the conversations around this one killer DeFi app that is like onboarding the next billion or a few billion. At least that's how I'd like to see it.
Hopefully that's Sushi.
Yeah, just back to regulatory. I'd love to see clarity, but I'd probably settle for just crypto not being viewed as the villain everywhere. I think that would be a good start. I don't think the industry has ever waited around for clarity to continue to move forward, and I think we we'll keep doing that as an industry. From a DEX perspective, one thing I think, at least in the US, if staking is continued to be viewed as a security, I think more staking will move to DEXs, and I think that might be an opportunity that they could take advantage of. But we'll see. Hopefully, they don't need to.
Yeah, I'll jump on the. I think it'd be great to see at least one highly liquid composable perpetual swap DEX, because I think we have exactly 0 of those right now. Although there's definitely some that are approaching it. Regulatory clarity would agree, great, but I'll also champion decentralized front ends, because I think that that's actually just going to, like, even in a very compliant way, that's actually just going to lead to, you know, more full stack applications that are in the ethos of what it is that we're building, and just trying to maximize access.
Amazing. I'm like so excited for the future of DeFi, especially with all of you, kind of building at the helm here. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm sure anyone watching this video, and hopefully those at the hackathon, have hopefully learned a lot from everyone's big brain energy. Really, really excited to be partnering with all of you, with Sushi, and yeah, thanks again for all joining us here today.
Yeah, thanks, Al.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.